Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our first Auckland Meetup live stream. And welcome also to anyone who is watching the recording after the event. It is a beautiful Tuesday evening here in the Wynyard Quarter in Auckland. And today I'll be hosting. My name is John DeLeo. I'm one of the co-leaders of the OWASP New Zealand chapter. And we'll have our guest speaker, Laura Bell, who will be presenting her talk, Failing Fast, after my segment on the OWASP Top 10. I want to welcome our one participant who was brave enough to join us in the room. What's your name? Jiren? Okay. Great to have you here. And a really warm welcome to everyone else who's joining us online. Now, one of the things that I do want to mention, the way that this will work is if you're watching on the YouTube live stream and you post a comment, I'm supposed to see those as live comments as they come in, and then we can use that to see any questions or comments so that we can address them. And so hello to Carlos. So it looks like it's working. Thank you for that test message. Our agenda for the evening is very similar to our usual networking meetup agendas, except for that we are accommodating the fact that we don't really have a large in-person group. So I'm going to do I already did the brief introductions. I'm going to do a brief overview of OWASP and the New Zealand chapter. Then I'd have a little bit of information about some upcoming events. After that, I'll do a short presentation about entry A1 in the 2017 OWASP Top 10. We'll take a short break to reconfigure some screens, and then we'll go into Laura's presentation. I'm expecting that we probably won't take the full 2 hours, so we'll go ahead and get started. So what is OWASP? For those of you who aren't familiar, of course, OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project. It is an open project focusing on web application security. It's global, it's community supported, and the focus is on improving the security of software. The OWASP project is managed by the OWASP Foundation, which is a global nonprofit headquartered in the US. You can learn lots more about OWASP on the OWASP webpage, owasp.org. There are about 260 active chapters, of which OWASP New Zealand is one. There are about 130 projects currently active. OWASP sponsors 2 or 3 global AppSec conferences a year. Of course, like with every other thing this year, 2020 is an exception. The Dublin conference was scheduled to be held in June. They decided to postpone that until next February in the hopes they could hold a face-to-face conference then. The outlook is not good at this point, but we can remain hopeful. The San Francisco conference, which is scheduled for next month during CyberSafe Week, is now virtual, and they've actually spread the events out a little bit more, so it's not just during that 5-day week. There are some preliminary events beforehand and a few afterwards. And then, of course, there are regional and local conferences and a number of training events that are held and hosted by local chapters throughout the world. Now, a little bit about OWASP projects. Currently, there are 14 flagship projects, along with dozens, actually over 100 smaller scale projects. They focus in these 4 areas. tools, things like the OWASP ZAP, Z-Attack Proxy tool, code, which can be libraries and some frameworks to help you write better code directly, lots of documentation, including things like the OWASP Top 10 and the cheat sheet series, which is one of the most popular OWASP projects these days. And then education and training resources, including things like the vulnerable web apps like OWASP Juice Shop and Security Shepherd, which can be used to learn how to identify and correct security flaws in web applications. Now, some of the flagship projects, a new one as of January of this year is OWASP Amass. Now, Amass is actually a resource discovery tool, a little bit like a Nessus scanner, only not quite so full of bells and whistles or commercial, but it helps you to understand what you have exposed on your network and to do some security perimeter scanning. I mentioned already the Z-Attack Proxy, the Top 10 project. Application Security Verification Standard is a great project. One that I'm actively involved in is the Software Assurance Maturity Model, or SAM project. And SAM 2.0 was released at the end of 2019. Dependency Track and Dependency Check can be used for managing dependencies and identifying vulnerabilities in libraries that you're using. And as I mentioned before, the OWASP Juice Shop, which is an intentionally vulnerable JavaScript storefront application, which is intended as an educational tool and can also be set up as a capture the flag type competitive environment for learners to use or for you to use with, say, staff in your organization. Now, a little bit about the chapter. The New Zealand chapter has been around since 2007. And our focus in running the chapter is to have there be educational activities here in New Zealand focused on the skill set around improving application security. It started with a couple of meetups. I think in 2007, there were two, one in Auckland, one in Christchurch. And now we have active meetups in two cities, Auckland and Wellington. We have a meetup in Christchurch, which is currently not active, but we're hoping to get that restarted soon. And then I still have that on there that we were hoping to have one or two meetups in Dunedin this year. At this point, I'll be really happy if we can squeeze one in before Christmas. Last year, Kirk Jackson, one of the other chapter leaders, founded the Security.ac.nz conference. This is a student-focused conference. It is free to attend and held on a weekend, where presenters from around New Zealand come in to talk about some application security and information security topics, but more importantly, to talk about what it's like to work in InfoSec and AppSec. So we're hoping to see that conference happen again next August, and with enough ambitious volunteers, extend beyond just one city. So maybe have it at Victoria University in Wellington one weekend, have it at University of Auckland another weekend, and maybe even go down to Otago another weekend. Try and spread the wealth of information. Our primary means of communication are the mailing list, New Zealand chapter at OWASP, which you're welcome to subscribe to. And if you screen capture that URL, then you can go ahead and subscribe, and then I'll approve you to join and you'll be part of the conversation. Now, we don't maintain our own public Slack workspace. Rather, we use the InfoSec NZ Slack workspace. So you'll hear about job opportunities in New Zealand and conferences and other events that are going on. are all discussed in the InfoSec NZ Slack. Some other local events. The Auckland Information Security Interest Group meets on the last Tuesday of most months. We're almost always at Tabak. Now the format for that is, since we're meeting at a pub, you turn up around 5:30, have yourself a pint or two, and then you can hear a brief talk by a speaker at 6:30. And then after that, it's networking, conversation, and we walk down the street to have some steak. So if you're in Auckland on the last Tuesday of the month, stop on by and come see us. The NZ Information Security Forum is run by Lech Janczewski at the University of Auckland, and they meet after breakfast on the second Thursday of every month. There are a lot of good topics there around information security in general. I've presented there a couple of times talking about OWASP SAM and other projects. So it's another great place to get good information on what's going on in InfoSec here in NZ. We have the ISC Squared and ISACA chapters. I happen to know when the Auckland chapters meet. I'm not sure if there are also Wellington chapters. We can add that to some future slides. And there's also a lock sport group that meets to practice lock picking on the third Wednesday of the month. So, OWASP's annual conference is now the AppSec New Zealand Conference, presented in collaboration with OWASP New Zealand. So it will be happening. We are keeping our fingers crossed that we will be at level 1 in February and able to meet face-to-face. So as in the previous OWASP New Zealand Day conferences, it will be held at the University of Auckland in the ONG Glen building. This year, we're going to have 2 days of training and a 2-day conference. So this will be our first time, I don't think ever, I believe one other time we tried to have a 2-day conference. So this will be the first time doing a 2-day, 2-track conference in a while. If you'd like to do a presentation or offer paid training, the CFP and CFT are going to open on the 1st of October. And we'll be opening registration for the conference and training in mid-December. It looks to be a good event. We've already got a few great sponsors lined up, and the lockdown fatigue. This may be the first chance in a while to get together and network with people at an actual conference. Except for this one. The Christchurch Hacker Conference, CHICON, is happening at the end of October. Oh, I did not correct this. The dates have shifted. It is now the 30th and 31st of October. So Friday and Saturday, with the AfterCon party on Halloween night in Christchurch. It's sorta, kinda, mostly sold out, but if you want to check at chcon.nz, there may be a few more tickets released now that all of the speakers have been selected and the schedule's been set. So that's what I have for the about information. Now, during this section of our larger face-to-face meetings, the intent is to just briefly give an overview of what's in the top 10 entry, what it's about, and then to seek feedback from the group in the room about their experiences in dealing with addressing and helping to prevent this particular vulnerability. Well, today, we're not going to have a lot of that feedback back unless people want to type really furiously so that I can read them out. So now, what is the top 10? it's important to realize the top 10 is an awareness document. It's to help people know about vulnerabilities that are prevalent in web applications. So specifically, it is the 10 reported most prevalent application flaws. Now that comes from two sources of data. We actually, for the 2017 edition, received detection data from, I believe it was 5 tool vendors. So Veracode, WhiteSource, I'm not actually sure which vendors provided data, provided their detection information on which flaws they were seeing when doing scans. The second source is input from subject matter experts. So there was a call for data that started around May of 2017 asking, please tell us what you see most often in your work. Using these two sources of data, the 10 most prevalent vulnerabilities were cataloged. In the top 10 document, the most common scenarios and consequences of each of the vulnerabilities are discussed. Some basic guidance on how to protect against them is provided. And an important thing, I'll probably be saying this forever, just because something isn't listed in the top 10 doesn't mean it's not important. It just doesn't make it to production as much. So for example, cross-site request forgery is no longer in the top 10 because protection is now very common. So it doesn't mean we don't have to worry about CSRF anymore. It just means we're doing a much better job of protecting against it. Now, entry A1 is injection. What is injection? These are flaws that occur when untrusted data are sent to an interpreter and get treated as part of a command or a larger query. So this is basically treating data as command input. So by presenting some hostile data, you're tricking an interpreter. So if you think about for a SQL query, if you're trying to execute a select query and you accept user input for some of the values to search for, if the attacker is allowed to cause their data to be treated as the termination of the select query followed by further commands, well, then they can have their way with the database. This is the point where I should have the XKCD Bobby Tables slide or comic. I'll have to put that in here for next time. General properties of this particular vulnerability. It is very easy to exploit when present. It is still extremely common. 2017 marks the 10th anniversary of the top 10, and injection has been #1 since the first edition. It's extremely easy for attackers to detect if the witness exists, and the technical impacts of having it can be quite high. Because once there is a SQL injection or command injection vulnerability, if the attacker is able to execute an arbitrary SQL command or an arbitrary OS command, then all sorts of bad things can occur. So how do I protect against it? Basically, make sure that the approach you're using for constructing these commands, whether it's a SQL statement or an operating system or system call command, make sure that you're using a safe approach, one that does not interpret the input directly into the command or query. So parameterized SQL queries are the most common approach for dealing with SQL injection. You can use things like ORM tools or indexed requests. So instead of saying, give me the object with ID 2263, you say, give me the information about the object that was second on the list you sent me. Or you could say, for a command request, have a lookup map. So instead of allowing the user's input to specify what command to execute, instead they send you a parameter value, say from a dropdown, that maps to a stored fixed command. And then by doing that, the user's input is not used directly. You want to make sure that the user performing your accesses has as restricted privileges as possible. In fact, you might have a read-only user and a CRUD user for SQL access, so that if the command being performed is a read operation, then it's performed by the read-only user. You only perform the action as a CRUD user if you need to perform an update. And of course, you want to make sure that the user never has permissions to do things like alter or drop tables. Where it's appropriate, make use of application security policies. So this is a way that you can limit the actions that an application is allowed to perform through a security manager that's provided. Java's security manager isn't a lot of fun to work with, but can be useful if configured well. And other platforms and frameworks provide similar security managers. When you're taking input from any potentially untrusted source, and really that means from anything that's not completely under the direct control of the receiver, you want to make sure that you validate it. And the preference is to do whitelist validation rather than blacklist, so that you specify these are the kinds of input that are acceptable, rather than try to capture all of the things you need to prevent. Where you need to take input from a possibly untrusted source and use it directly, say as a parameter in a query, make sure that you're using encoding APIs so that anything that's potentially unsafe is escaped. This is also true if it's going to be fed back to the user, say in HTML, then you want to make sure that it's encoded so that it does not get interpreted as, say, an embedded script to prevent cross-site scripting. Now, this is a point where I always like to talk about one of OWASP's success stories. The Enterprise Security API, or ASAPI, really isn't used very much anymore. And that's a great thing. When I first started doing Java web app development way too long ago, a lot of the frameworks we were working with, say Struts 1, didn't include these security APIs to let you do the validation and encoding. So the OWASP project, or a project of OWASP, filled that gap by creating the ASAPI package. And it was available as a Java jar, which you could then import and use within a Java application. It was then extended into a .NET version. And I believe for a while there was also one other language, which I'm now forgetting. And it was used extensively. Eventually, framework vendors got better at providing these tools. So once they became available in the frameworks, it was no longer necessary to go and get a third-party API to do the job. So ASAPI fell out of use. And that's really what you want, is you want to be doing such a great job and promoting good hygiene and secure practices to the point that you're no longer needed. And that everything about OWASP as an overall endeavor is really about that. In a perfect world, we wouldn't need to do this anymore. In the real world, we're constantly helping new people learn how to stop making the same mistakes as last year's new grads. When you're talking about something that involves requesting data from a source, apply result set limits. So for example, if you're asking for search parameters and you make a mistake so that an essential return all results query gets accepted by the processor, if you then have a result set size limit, it still won't dump the entire set of records. It may stop at 50 results or 100 results. I discovered when I was working at a US government agency, we used the USA.gov search engine, and it was not protected against SQL injection. So the very first time I tried to use it, and I escaped or 1 equals 1, and it attempted to return all results for the entire US government, the application fell over. So this is the thing you want to try and avoid. And that was all I was going to talk about. I haven't seen anybody typing big, long questions or experience comments. Okay. And that takes us to just about 6:30 local time. At this time, I'm going to be continuing the broadcast, but we're going to break for about, I'm thinking, 4 minutes. I'm going to rearrange the studio a little bit, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to Laura. Okay, so we'll have just a few minutes of silence, and truth is, I need a comfort break.
Hey, Elena. John's just stepped away right now. I'd love for the crowd. Who else out there has got an opinion on this? How do you distinguish whether something is from an untrusted source? Extra imaginary conference points for putting it in a comment on the video. I'll give you a second to try, and then I'll just start talking because that's what I do. John, you have a question from the audience.
Yes, it looks like I do. And so the first one was, and this question is about our presentation. So I'm new, but I was just wondering how you distinguish whether something was from an untrusted source. If you had a public-facing website, wouldn't everything trying to access you be untrusted? So the answer to the second part is yes. And Carl's spoken up. I think untrusted is any data coming from users or external sources that is not coming from your code. So that's a big part of it. Is if you've got data that's coming from a known clean data source, so a properties file that was built into your application deployment artifact, if it's coming from your database, you would treat that as trusted. If it's coming from a service which is also under your control, then you would treat the service response as trusted. Once you get to anything else, then you treat it as potentially untrusted. Now, when you think about that, it just makes good sense to treat almost any external input as potentially untrusted, just to be safe. So even where I mentioned, if you're receiving data from a trusted service, so say it's an internal business service that's managed within your organization, you might still want to treat that as untrusted, just in case someone is able to tamper with the data being passed. The counter argument, of course, is that there's usually a performance impact from doing the extra validation and extra encoding. So for high performance systems, there's going to be this argument that, oh, well, we can treat that as trusted because we know it's going to be safe, and we need to shave those microseconds off the responses. That is a valid conversation to have, but in the end, it's usually better to be a little bit slower and more safe than just that tiny bit faster and really sorry. Okay. Hopefully, Elena, that's a sufficient answer. And at this time, I'm going to go ahead and add Laura's presentation to the stream and actually take myself out once I introduce her and move my window.
All right. Okay, we're getting there. Just to answer Tom's point there, I'm on the more cautious side, and I agree with you, Tom. I do tend to trust everything about the same, which is about no trust at all. So whether it's come from internal or external, whether it's binary data or some other format, most of the applications we build, almost everything we're building now, it can take the performance overhit. So, sure, trust each other. We all love each other very much. We design systems we should trust, but verify it. There's no real harm in taking that extra step. But then I'm a security nerd, so I'm literally paid to be paranoid.
Isn't that the truth for all of us who do this all day, every day? All right. So welcome back to the second part of our gathering this evening. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Laura Bell, who's going to be presenting to us this evening. Laura is the founder and principal at SafeStack, which is a New Zealand company focusing on Actually, I'm not sure all the things you're focusing on these days, but it's mainly around security training and awareness and some consulting. I should have asked.
I could really do this myself, so it's all good.
Okay.
All
And
right.
tonight she'll be presenting Failing Fast, talking about the impact of bias when speeding up application security. And the floor is yours, Laura. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Good evening, everybody. Now, you're going to have to bear with the virtual format's hard. It's a bit strange as a speaker, so I don't get all the cues. I don't see your lovely faces. Please do make use of the comments functionality. Just bear in mind, I can't type responses. So I'm going to look there. I'm going to try and call out any questions or queries. So make use of it. It's a great chance to be interactive no matter where you are physically right now. If you're watching this at home afterwards, you can see contact details on the screen here, and I'm more than happy to answer your questions. Extra special points if you send an animated GIF, because my inbox is a cesspool. Okay, so my name is Laura Bell. As John said, I am the founder of SafeStack. We primarily help organizations go very, very fast and do security on the way. And sometimes that's awareness, sometimes it's training, and a lot of the time it's working with application developers and those involved in the engineering space. We've been doing this for many, many years now. I actually really love that John brought up eSAPI. I haven't heard that phrase in a long time. As being one of the contributing devs in 2007 to the eSAPI edition for PHP, there is a lot of huge amounts of talent in that OWASP community who are giving their time, and they have done for many, many years. So if you do ever get the chance to give back to one of those projects, please do use your spare cycles, your spare spoons, and see if you can help out on one of them. They're always looking for volunteers. So tonight, I want to have a quick talk with you about failing fast. Now, I don't mean the cool failing fast that we do in startups where every mistake is okay because we validated and learned something. In security, when we fail, it tends to get a bit mucky and we tend to end up in the press. So we don't like failing fast as much when it comes to security. We save that for when it's functionality or product validation. Now, tonight, I'm going to look at 3 different common causes of fast failure when doing your application security, and they all link to a type of bias, 3 different types of bias, in fact. Now, the desire to go faster is really human. I love going faster. Most of you would rather do fast and innovative work than do something boring every day. You know, we don't want to go slow and do monotonous things, so we try and speed things up. We automate, we try and make things more efficient. We try and not do stuff if we can get away with it. It's a perfectly natural human response. In development, we're no different. Now, in this talk tonight, we're going to talk about 3 types of bias that get in the way of us doing this. The first is seniority bias, the idea we can only go faster if we used experienced engineers. Secondly, our tool bias. We can only go faster if we buy this tool or system. And finally, recency bias. We can only go faster if we do this thing I read about last week. Now, as somebody who's speaking at an event, I see the irony in me talking about recency bias and trying to tell you to do a thing, but you can forgive me that little bit of a vicious circle. Finally, we're going to do a little bit about how we overcome that bias and help ourselves go a little bit faster without making some common mistakes. Now, all of the things I'm talking about here are from real world experience. I've been doing agile application security now for 6 years. And so I've worked with all sorts of teams of shapes and sizes, and they all do it a bit differently. Now, I don't care which particular shade of fast you are. I don't care if your team calls it agile or Kanban. If you're DevOps, DevSecOps, or anything in between. It really is just a label, and those labels help you communicate your development style to the people around you, but they don't dictate too heavily on what you have to do. You know, we don't live in a very dogmatic, draconian way of development. We just use these labels to make it easier to tell friends and colleagues and new recruits what it is to expect. Now, what I mean today is going fast. So these are the types of life cycles where we want to build and compile or deploy our code multiple times in a period, instead of our older school where we might be deploying multiple times a year, 2 or 3 times a year. We're talking about, you know, dozens of times a year or a few times a day. And I don't mind where you are on that transition. There will be people on this feed today who are still doing more waterfall approaches. That's okay. There's things for you to take away here. And there's going to be people at the extreme end who deploy to production 100 times a day. That's awesome too. Remember to take the context and the message from this for where you are now, not for the glorious, glamorous Netflix version of how DevSecOps should work, because very few of us get to work in those perfect environments. So let's talk about seniority bias. As somebody who's getting a little bit older now and doesn't like to admit how many years she's been in software development, seniority bias does touch a little bit close to the heart. The idea with seniority bias, and you may actually see this in your teams, is the idea that your team can only go faster if you hire or use experienced or senior engineers for your key roles. We're going to talk about how this sort of comes out in just a moment. We'll look at the symptoms. In fact, I'd love for you to play at home too. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you the symptoms of a seniority bias. Now, I'd love for you to do a little quick self-assessment and think, does my team have this in it right now? If you do, you can share on the comments if you like. If you don't want to share, that's cool too. But have a think, because if you've shown up with one or more of the three, then maybe there's something you could do in your team tomorrow when you get back to work. So, is it true then that we have to have senior engineers to go fast? I'm going to say no. It's a bit misleading. We like to think so because senior engineers have learned all the lessons already, right? They know what they're doing. But I'd love you to, if you're playing along in the comments, raise your hand if you are counted as senior but have made a mistake in the last 2 weeks. I've definitely have, so I'm raising my hand here. Symptoms of seniority bias in your teams. Things like only advertising roles or recruiting senior level engineers. Now, if you go out to market in security and in application development, we do see a heavy bias to 3 to 5 years experience or 5+ years experience. And that's really hard. It really limits the pool of people we can bring in. And it also creates a bias in terms of the type of experience they've had. Those of us who started at the same time as each other, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, all come from the same kind of family tree of languages and frameworks and approaches. Second symptom, if you aren't just advertising roles at the senior level, is to use named individuals and make them responsible for the peer review of all your pull requests. So we accept, right, in our development flows that we're going to want to get our pull requests or reviewed before they are merged in. Great, awesome. That's been a standard requirement now for some time in our development flows. Now, if your organization is always saying, well, you know, Taylor has to do all of our peer reviews because they know this stuff, they've been around a while, or, you know, Ryan, they have to do this. We're creating another kind of risk in doing this. This seniority bias, because of this experienced engineer getting all the pull requests, is creating what we call a key person risk. And we're going to come back to that in the next minute when we talk about the overall impact of this bias. That bias you have towards using the best person for the job or the most senior can actually create a self-perpetuating problem in your team. Because you're doing it, you'll never actually improve your skills. We make assumptions in our team about common sense or that practices are universally known. I know I'm guilty of it. I say phrases like simply or basically or obviously in my sentences. And I'm like, oh yeah, well, obviously we all know how to fix this. You know, I'm old enough to remember the OWASP top 10 before 2017. And I know at least once I've said, well, obviously the SQL injection vulnerabilities. Obvious isn't obvious to everyone. And common sense isn't as common as we'd like to believe. Our experiences are different. Depending on where you started your development journey and where you are now and the road you've taken to get there, depends on the lessons you've learned on the way and how you are able to communicate those. If we always favor our seniors and we imply that that comes with this universal level of knowledge, then we can come unstuck when we realize that that shared experience we expect to have happened didn't happen at all. How many of you started off on a really old school language? My first language was COBOL, so, you know, I could always have a job, but it's a job I'd never want. Some of you will have started out in much newer languages and frameworks. So there's a whole generation coming through with JavaScript. Now, for people like me and people like JavaScript developers, we couldn't be more different. Our common sense, our universally shared experience are polar opposites. So what are the impacts of these biases? If you did your self-assessment and you've got one or more of them, how is that going to impact on your team? And how is that going to change the way that we can do software at pace? Now, I tried very hard to get a gender-neutral old person image here, so you'll have to forgive me. I thought I did all right if you sort of assume they're wearing a strange hat. What can the impact of seniority bias be? Well, burnout of key people. Now, we've been talking about this a lot lately in the community, in the wider community. We wanted to make sure that we understand that if you keep pushing people really, really hard, day in, day out, over long periods of time, they break. We break. I know I've been there. I know many of you will have experienced this first or second hand. If we always expect our seniors to take this heavy load to help us go fast, then in fact, we damage over time our efficiency at doing so. So they are unable to sustain that pace. It's too hard, it's too high. They're unable to take their breaks, take leave, or they feel this commitment or this fear that if they do, things will break in their absence. Now, if these people happen to leave the organization, we all hope we're going to be offered the dream job and, jet off into the sunset, no matter what that job is. If those people leave, we end up with a hole. Institutional knowledge is gone because we've layered it all into these seniors. And when we do this, we create massive impacts on staff handover. We end up with stagnation of approaches and ideas as new voices aren't heard and improvements aren't suggested. Now, this isn't always the case. Our younger folk, our newer, less experienced folk don't always know better. However, I know that I've been around newer developers who they have more energy than I do. They are spending time reading the white papers that I don't get to because I have a toddler. They are the ones that are digesting the new approaches and sitting through 20 hours of conference talks that we don't get around to. And so just because they haven't been sat in your seat for a long time, it doesn't mean they don't have a viewpoint that isn't important. And by leaving them out or by focusing our attention just on our seniors, we lose that. There's also poor knowledge and cross-sharing. Now, I do a lot of training. I do a lot of working with teams and individuals to make sure that their skills are developing and they're progressing in their security journey. Now, I'm assuming that many of the people in this chat today, I know there's a few that are definitely in the more senior roles and there's some that are starting out. We rely on sharing these roles around and not just having our seniors in these positions to make sure everyone eventually becomes a senior. So by starving people of the opportunity to take risks, to review code, to be that single point, we starve them of the experience that's going to make them useful to our team later. In short, when we have a seniority bias and we're trying to go fast at application security, in the short term, we will go faster because we have implicit institutional knowledge that's being used really heavily. But over time, that actually degrades and we go slower. So if you're in a team that has any form of seniority bias right now, I would love you to go back and try and find a way to unpick any of those symptoms you see. And that could be hiring a broader range of skills and experiences. It could be making sure that there's different people assigned pull requests on each time you have one. Or it could just be making sure that you ban certain phrases from your team, maybe have a little jar and you can put a coin in it, or you have to show an animated GIF, whatever your culture is, where if you say, obviously, basically, oh, that's common sense, or, oh, they'll know, they've been a developer a while. Every time you hear one of those phrases, I'd love you to fine yourself or fine your team in the fun spirit of the word, not in the mean and nasty spirit of it. Because the more we get used to security knowledge not being uniform, and that we need to articulate and communicate better, then this risk will start going down a little bit. So that's our seniority bias. As somebody who's been in that seat, you don't want to be the person who is the senior in charge of things, who has been the bottleneck. It doesn't work, it doesn't scale, and you end up very, very, very tired. Now, next up, tool bias. Now, I'd love you to raise your metaphorical hand, whether you're at home or sit in your room, raise your hand to yourself. If you have ever bought something with the express idea that it would solve all of your problems, the silver bullet, the magic box, the thing that's going to make all of those nasty things that are troubling you go away. As the proud owner of at least one gym membership I never used, I've definitely hit this one myself outside of my profession, as well as inside. So the idea with tool bias is we can only get faster if we buy this tool or system. Now, as somebody who works a lot with younger companies and smaller teams, this one's really hard. It can feel like you're not going to be able to go fast because you haven't got the budget to buy these fancy tools. These are tens of thousands of dollars worth of tools and systems. Now, if that's the case and you feel like you're excluded from doing it because you don't have a tool, it means that when you finally do get a little bit of budget, you might spend it really badly because, the idea you could just buy the tool and get the job done, you might save up for a while and get it. In fact, you could spend your smaller budget in different ways and achieve a better result. Let's dig into that a little bit. Now, like last time, we're going to do a bit of self-assessment. So here's the symptoms of tool bias. So can you spot any of these in your team? You're spending thousands of dollars on tools or systems to integrate into your development lifecycle. Now, it might well be you have tens of thousands of dollars and you're doing this awesomely well. But for most teams, there's normally a bit of spending on tools that you put in and it hits number 2. So tools purchased were not properly implemented into your build pipeline, or were implemented and then removed because they caused pain. The problem with a tools bias is we tend to mistake the fact that owning a tool is going to solve the problem, when in fact owning the tool, implementing it, tuning it and managing it might help with the problem, but it won't solve the problem on its own. There may be no plan for maintaining, tuning or configuring any tools post-purchase. Now, I like to call this a salesperson-driven development. So if you're in an organization that has encountered one of these salespeople, they normally have really good vendor pitches and sometimes they give you t-shirts and stickers. But at the end of it, you're probably going to get an invoice for tens of thousands of dollars. Now, if you find that you've got these devices in your network, that could be a vulnerability scanner, it could be some form of version control add-on or dependency checker. If you know they're there, but there's no plan, there's nobody in charge of looking after them, or they're causing your pipeline pain, you've got a tool bias that needs to be unpicked. So what is the impact of a tool bias? Oh, whoopsie daisy, animations. There we go, a hammer. Right. Tools may be purchased a long time before they're required. So this is the equivalent of me deciding that I'm going to renovate my house maybe in December. And right now I'm going to go and buy myself the pretty cushions to sit in my living room. Now, there's no point in buying those cushions until I've renovated the house. I'm literally going to fill the house with sawdust and plaster dust and all sorts of muck. Now, in the tool world, in our dev world, if you are only just starting out on your development pipeline, so you're moving from something quite manual to something more automated, and then purchasing heavyweight tools up front is a really bad idea. You've got to get used to the cadence and flow of your development pipelines first before you can add more tools into them. Tom Isaacson making a great point there in the comments that also buying multiple tools to solve different problems without checking if fewer or one more tool could solve them all. Absolutely. Now, this is particularly problematic if you have a split focus in your application development area. So perhaps you have a DevOps team or an ops team, you have developers and engineers, and then maybe you even have a security team separately. Now, if each one of those has separate budgets to solve the same problems and there isn't any coordination, this happens frequently. And this is where we see, somebody's put OWASP dependency checker in to check their vulnerabilities, somebody else has bought a SonarQube license, and we're doing the same check twice. Making sure you buy the right tool for the right job at the right time not just saves you money, but also it stops you from getting in the way of learning those foundation lessons about your pipeline. How quickly does it go? What are the other things that's going to disrupt you? I can promise you, adding security tools to your pipeline is not going to speed up your pipeline. It will probably make it more painful and more slow. That's fixable, but you have to know that going into it, because if you rush and you put them in, that initial experience you will have with an automated or fast-paced pipeline will be severely degraded. And that's going to really damage any cultural investment you have in going fast. That analysis of the impact on your workflow is really important. So some security tools, so if we look at dependency checkers, for example, versus vulnerability scanners, a dependency checker might check all of the dependencies on your project and say, hey, you've got an out-of-date version of this package here and you should update it before you continue, and it might break your build. That's quite easy to put in flow in your pipeline, and the impact might be a few seconds or a few breaks as and when you're notified of an out-of-date dependency. But what about a vulnerability scanner or an automated security testing tool? Now, these are much heavier weight tools, and often to do a scan or a testing suite against your application might take, instead of a 6-minute build pipeline, it might take you over an hour. And sticking that into your workflow suddenly changes a very fast-paced continuous deployment or continuous integration pipeline into a very, very painful process. Now, at this point, if you've done your analysis in advance, you're able to then decide if that really does need to go in line or if it can come out as a parallel workflow for you. If you don't do that analysis, you're going to learn by doing, and the impact on that is going to cause frustration in your teams, and you're going to have nothing really to show for it. Just following up on another comment there, as we've got a chance to include them here. So a comment from Carlos, or you blow the dollars on the licenses and have nothing left for training and capacity building. Absolutely. A device is not cheap. We're talking thousands of dollars. And while that might not normally equate to a full-time person, it would go a long way. And sometimes you can choose other more sustainable things like upskilling your people or even just giving them some time in their week to experiment instead of spending that money on the tool. Now, tools and processes that are offboarded out of development teams also create a really fractured approach. So if you've got a team where you're doing your development and you've got a team over here, maybe in another country in some cases, that they're going to do the security checks for you. They'll do your vulnerability scan. They'll do your dependency checking. Now, theoretically, that could have some advantages. You know, your team isn't going to be distracted from their core purpose of writing the code. However, by creating that barrier and that divide, it's some of those principles we were trying to avoid with DevSecOps to begin with have come back. So we wanted to avoid the idea that we threw our code over the fence and made it somebody else's problem. But security tools put in place at the wrong time in the wrong places can actually make that problem come back again. And in this case, can be worse because those tools are very slow, often deliver very big sets of informational findings, and it's been done by someone else. Coordinating across your security, your operations, and your development, however that looks for you, is really key, especially when it comes to maintaining and managing these tools and processes. Just to circle back to the comment I made at the start, it's the gym membership effect. The idea may have the organization may believe it has solved their security problems by that investment. So if you communicated to your senior team, hey, I need to solve some security and here's my budget request to buy this tool, they will see that line budget item and go, okay, we invested this money, so therefore we have done security. Buying the tool does not make you good at security. Buying a gym membership does not make you a marathon runner or make you fit or healthy. You have to use it. And so be careful when you have any kind of tool situation where you think there's a tool bias, that you're not communicating to the people around you, your stakeholders, that you succeeded in security, when in fact, what you succeeded in is putting in a tool. The success comes from the maintenance, the configuration and use of that tool in a way that helps you go faster. So I'd like you to go back after this today, and I want you to look at your tool bias. How many tools do you have in your ecosystem? Are they doing unique jobs? Are they being used to their full potential? And if you have found a tool bias, I want you to make me a little promise, hand on heart today, that you will not buy another security tool until you either get rid of one or you use the ones you already have. Because our industry is a $79 billion a year security industry. It's huge. And they are not selling tools that are necessarily very easy for us to use or that are solving our problems. So I want you to be very discerning. It's the developers, people like yourself, who actually control the destiny of security and development working together. It's not the tool companies. So that brings us to our third type of bias, and that's a recency bias. Now, recency bias isn't unique to security. It's a well-documented bias. It means that we think we can only go faster if we do the latest thing we read about. Now, if you've ever been in a product role or you're doing any product development, you see recency bias when your backlog explodes. We've got to do this feature and this feature and this feature because we've just been asked about it by our customers. And if you action all of those things straight away, you'll end up switching tasks a lot and none of your features will get done. This is called a recency bias, where you're always chasing the latest thing somebody's asked you for. Now, it's really easy in technology to have a recency bias because most of us are avid consumers of information. We watch talks, we read books, we share papers, we share links, and we are the type of people that are wired for getting more information. And so if we are continually processing all of this new information and bringing it in, there's a real strong chance that we're going to end up splitting our focus and doing lots and lots of things poorly instead of doing the one thing we need to do well. So let's do another self-assessment. We'll do our symptoms of a recency bias. So if you've got all three by the end of tonight, you know, full house, three biases to fix. So you will have a recency bias if you have lots of started but incomplete security initiatives. So you might even have a security backlog, and it may have been kicking around for several months. If you have lots and lots of initiatives that have been started, maybe you did the big glitzy kickoff for them, but then they just kind of all went quiet, this might be you. If your initiatives are losing momentum quickly after kickoff or failing to achieve their measurable outcomes, again, might be a sign of a recency bias that's often caused by the fact that the attention span, the energy, the focus of the team has been diverted onto something else, and we haven't had the energy or the message to keep that going. It takes quite a lot of time to get from I want to do security in my application development team to we're doing it consistently and we've got this in place. If you are seeing your team frequently focus shifting, so they are not sticking on one project very long, or there are conflicting requirements and a lot of, well, I can't finish this because I've got too many other things on, this is probably going to be a sign of recency bias. And this happens, like I said, not just in security, but in the overall development of your applications. It can definitely be happening at a functional level too. If you're in a team like many teams in New Zealand where they don't have a dedicated security person, now bearing in mind New Zealand's average security team size is 1.5 people, I believe. It's a very, very small number. The bigger ones out there, you know, your Sparks of the world have 20, 30 plus people, but most companies, they have one person, possibly part-time, who's also probably the head of engineering or a very keen developer. If you're in one of those situations where you don't have a security leader, then this shift in focus can also be a recency bias competing between security and more functional tasks in the development space. So be mindful, this might actually be split over a couple of domains. So if you have one or more of those, you may have a recency bias. And believe me, I've been there. I am guilty of this too. It's always easier to start things than it is to finish them. And it's always tempting to jump on the latest thing and go, oh yeah, that's really cool. I'll try that. Because you've got a whole community of other excited people around you. So it's quite a natural experience to then try and jump in too. Security often comes with the burden of having to convince others that you need to do a thing, or they need to change, or they need to adapt. And that's hard, it's slow, and in some organizations, incredibly painful. So it's natural then we see this recency bias because it gives us that sense of achievement. We're still pushing forward on new things. If any of those are true, then let's have a look at the impact of those. Nope. So what is the impact of our recency bias? Well, firstly, we're wasting time and money. You know, if we've got a massive amount of backlog of started projects, but they're all unfinished, then that's a lot of hours. That's a lot of time spent on things that haven't really reached the impact that they needed to get the job done. If you're in a big organization, you have lots of money, that's great. But we're living in pretty challenging times. And for many organizations and many development teams now, we're being much more mindful of the hours we spend and the budget we're spending on our projects. So in security particularly, I want to make sure that every hour you spend on security counts. Focus down things one thing at a time and take a step forward confidently rather than lots of little steps in different directions. Recency bias can give you the perception you're working hard, but doesn't give the achievable, measurable outcomes that we would like. Now, you might be a starter. You might be the type of person who loves ideas and kicking things off. And it does make you feel like you've achieved a lot. But if it isn't helping your team, if you aren't reducing the number of vulnerabilities that have been found in your code, if you aren't speeding up the time it's taken to run a security scan or test, then are you really achieving what you set out to? Make sure you link all of the initiatives you kick off to some sort of measurable aim. And make sure you always ask yourself before you start them, am I doing this because it's the right thing to do? Or am I doing this because it makes me feel good that I'm doing it? There's a wonderful book called about ego that I highly recommend, that I'll stick in the comments afterwards. It's talking about taking your own ego out of your engineering and your product practice, because it's that ego bit that likes us to feel like we're validating ourselves by kicking off new things all the time. Sometimes our recency bias also undervalues the complexity of some initiatives. It might seem really easy in that blog post that you read or in that conference talk that you saw at some big name conference. But that conference talk or that blog post might have simplified what had been 6 months of learning for that team. They may have skipped over all of the lessons that they had to adapt to their context. And it might seem more generally easy than perhaps it actually is. So if you do have a recency bias and you're kicking off a lot of things but not completing them, make sure you're giving each a realistic amount of time to get to fruition before you start off something else. If you found that initiative from a big name source, so it was a big branded company that's talked about it publicly, then really consider carefully how similar their environment and their context is to yours before bringing it into you. Because you could spend a lot of time, for example, in performance, scaling your application to the best that React can provide, which Facebook needs to function, when in fact, you don't need that because you have 20 users a day and they're okay with a tiny little bit of lag. Security is the same. Don't scale your security to keep out nation state actors and to do advanced persistent threat or whatever the latest hype cycle is in the conference security feed. Tailor it to your environment and make sure you're picking the projects that suit your risk and your threat profile. Recency bias often leads to teams being overstretched. You've got too many things on and there aren't enough resources. And that's really destructive to morale, to culture, and to achievement. So making sure that you are saying no to more security initiatives than you're doing. I'd love you to do just 1 or 2 really well, rather than try and do all of the different recommendations that are out there for doing fast-paced security. If you pick the 2 that suit your environment the best, and you give them the time and the resource they need to flourish, you will see noticeable improvement. You will see the quality of your code and the amount of refactoring reduce. You will see the number of vulnerabilities identified at penetration testing or external or automated security testing reduce. And hopefully you will see the quality of the results out in the world if you have a bug bounty program match up to this. There are lots of ways we can measure it, but if your team is overstretched and trying to do too many things, they will achieve none of them. So how do we overcome this bias? How do we make sure that we take that bias out of the equation and build fast software in a secure way? The first thing we have to do is admit that we all have bias, lots of them. There's dozens of different types of bias out there, and I'd love for you to go and read about some of them. There are some really great infographics and posters you can stick on your development team wall about the types of bias you might already have in your development practice. We all have bias. That statement is not a justification for you having them. It's just a description. It's a truth. It's a statement. So if we accept we have bias, but that's not okay, we can start to work on it. We can also gently and in a blameless way question each other. Are we making good decisions because it's the right decision to make, or is it because we're biased in some way? How to challenge bias comes in 3 forms. The first comes in discipline. Overcoming your innate behaviors to take on too many things, to try and start too many projects, to focus on your seniors rather than taking a risk on a junior. All of this takes overwhelming amounts of discipline to get started. And you have to do every decision you make, you need to reflect back and say, well, am I falling into one of these traps? And it needs the openness and vulnerability in your team that people can call each other out. If you're doing a peer review and you think there's some sort of confirmation bias in what has been expected in the functionality, you need to be free and safe to bring that up. It needs focus. Hiring broadly and not relying on glitzy tools to save the day takes time. And it means that you're going to do less stuff, which for those of you who measure your productivity and your worth on the amount of things you do at the same time as somebody who is an active relaxer, that's my crime. Taking it slow and doing less will feel like you're not doing as much. I'm doing less security because I'm doing less stuff. You're not. What you're doing is you're doing higher quality focused security rather than spreading yourself too thin, trying to tick all of the boxes to do DevSecOps. If you take it one bit at a time, one tool at a time, one challenge at a time, and do it well, the outcome will be much, much better than if you didn't focus. You also need to be consistency. Security is not a short battle. It is a fight that is held over months and months and years. And in fact, it has to be consistently applied for the life of your application. Now, I don't know about you, but most of us have tools out in the world that we wrote a very long time ago that are still live and kicking somewhere on a server. We have to consistently apply these kind of skills, this kind of security focus for its entire life, not just the life we would like to focus on when it's new and relevant and cutting edge. It's very easy to fall back into old habits if you're pushed for time or stress, which is why we need to make sure that we're spreading this load across a team, that we're not taking on too much. Overcoming your bias is one of the key things you can do to go faster in security, which seems like a really non-technical thing to say, but it's true. You're engineers. If you wanted to solve a technical challenge when it comes to securing your applications, you will go and find the white paper, you will go and find the book, you will go and get on with it. I've no doubt about it. That's literally how your brain is wired. But when it comes to unpicking our bias and unpicking the softer side of this is the hard work. This is our graph we all have to do to make sure our applications are more secure and that we're spreading that knowledge and that awareness and that champion behavior across our entire team. And by spreading it over the entire team, regardless of whether they're starting out or more senior, whether they have a tool or not, we are able to go much, much faster. It's much, much easier to build a house when you've got a team of 20 people than it is to do it on your own. And building a secure house is no different. So, fast-paced security isn't easy and there is no quick fix, but there are some really common mistakes we see, especially when it comes to not reflecting on and being aware of our biases. So that's bias around seniority, bias around the tools that we use and our requirement to have them, and our bias towards recency, so doing the latest cutting edge thing. Now, this is just a short section of the bias you might have, but I'd love for you to go back to your teams and reflect on this. Can you find ways to simplify your security by spreading the load over different levels of seniority, by pulling out or replacing tools or not buying so many tools, and by stopping doing all the things you hear about and just focusing on the one or two that suit your context the best? Right, that is it from me tonight. If you have any questions, I'm going to be on the feed for the next short while, and I'm more than happy to answer them. Alternatively, as mentioned at the beginning, you can find me on Twitter as @lady_nerd, or you can find me on email as hello@safestack.io, and one of me or the team will be happy to answer your question. If not, it's been lovely to join you today or tonight or wherever you are in the world, and I hope that you're staying safe and that we cross paths again soon.
Thank you, Laura. Do we have any questions coming in from the comment crowd? Any questions from our plethora of attendees in the room? Well then, thank you so much, Laura, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. For those of you who are checking out the recording after the fact, thank you for finding us and giving us a listen, and we look forward to seeing you either in person or virtually at our next Auckland meetup on Tuesday, November 10th. I'm pretty sure I got that date right, when Tom Isaacson will be joining us. So he'll be presenting on a topic as yet to be announced, and I'll start us off with a discussion of OWASP A2. And assuming that we're able to meet in person, primarily in person, we'll be hosted at the new PwC offices near Britomart Station. So they're offering us both a nice place and, I'm told, a really good spread of food. So plan on joining us. Thank you all and have a great evening.